Good morning. Very good to talk. And as Dave said, this is the place where I go and reflect on lean transformations and all my trips. And actually, in the last 6 weeks, I've only visited that occasionally because I've done 4 summits, and this is the 4th summit in the last 6 weeks. So that's where we are based, and that's where I reflect. But I've had the opportunity over the last 4 summits to talk to a great number of people, and to think about not just the practice that we're developing, the lean practice that we're developing to do the right things, but actually what the world is thinking about and the pressures and the narrative that is driving business decisions, and they're not always the same. Indeed, I think for the last 20 years we've been developing an awareness and practice of lean. The world has been looking at very different perspectives. Initially, globalization and the struggle to survive in a globalized world as people moved to China and everybody sought low-cost locations and so on, that resonated with people. Either they ignored the lean message or they saw lean in terms of, well, this is a sophisticated form of cost-cutting that can help us to survive in that global world. And more recently, as that impact also then became clear to the politicians and to the public sector, we've seen the same kind of emphasis on cutting, and now we're beginning to see even the same kind of outsourcing activities in the public sector as well. Dramatic cuts in budgets. So the whole world has actually been thinking about, how do I cut? And not surprisingly, that's the message that they heard from the lean community, and that's what they interpreted lean to be. However, I think we're at an inflection point. I may be wrong, but my hunch is that we're at an inflection point. And the 2 things that are really driving that, on the one hand, it's clear that in every country, taxes are never going to rise again. And so there isn't going to be more money to spend both on public services but also on infrastructure renewal. And on the other hand, over the last 20 years, middle-class living standards have been actually flat. And there's no reason to suspect that living standards are going to suddenly rise again, so there's not going to be a lot more additional purchasing power, actually. And so increasingly, as I go around, I hear people talking about the need to do more. We need more public services, we need more infrastructure renewal, but we're going to have to do it with what we've got. And so I think this changes the rhetoric and the narrative that we are playing into, if you like, into transforming the message from it's all about cost cutting to it's all about how do we do an awful lot more without incurring additional costs. So that's actually shifting lean to a message from one of cost cutting to one of this is the engine of growth. And I think we need to reflect on that and emphasize and recast the way we talk about lean to actually signal to the world that actually lean is the only way, actually, that existing organizations and even new organizations are going to actually be able to do more, significantly more, with the resources we have. Even the construction firms are saying it is very difficult to find additional people. Even at this point in the recession when the work and the infrastructure projects are really rolling and coming in. So think about that. It's a big challenge for the lean movement to recast our message in terms of growth. Now, the other side of the story is that we have a prevailing business model that has been all about capturing markets in order to control premium pricing. And that's been a prime objective of the traditional business model. And the headquarters has been all about playing those games of controlling markets and finding niches and dominating markets. And so headquarters has all been about the politics of doing that, rather than the focus on how do we focus on our efforts on improving our operations or our sales activities or our supply chain. And indeed, when I look at most multinationals, the list of projects and the list of activities that the top execs have, these are long, long lists. And clearly are pet projects for each department. They're not usually aligned. They're all about a new IT system here, a new initiative over here. There's a collection of politically negotiated projects. Quite clearly, a very difficult in that politically charged environment to actually focus efforts on the vital few things that will make the biggest difference to the organization. So we've been to many of these multinationals, and it occurs to me that in fact the biggest cost saving actually is at headquarters. Biggest potential cost saving. And indeed, one multinational, when I asked them jokingly what would happen if headquarters disappeared, said, well, we know exactly what would happen because last summer we had a major crisis in the organization when everybody was on holiday from headquarters and the organization solved the problem without us. So I thought it was kind of interesting. So we've been looking down into operations for all the savings. I think the big savings are at the top in these politically charged battlefields with PowerPoint, trying to bargain the political position of different functions. That business model leads to silo working. It's essentially about vertical. It's also about the illusion of control and optimization of resources. When you look actually at how assets are being used, they're usually not making the right thing. And they're usually the asset utilization that you're supposed to be maximizing is actually very poor because there's no discipline of the integration of steps to force the actions that would improve the utilization of the whole process and those individual assets. So actually assets are misused and information flows are chaotic. Less visible and easy to see, but in every industry we've been in, the information flows are chaotic that are driving decisions, and they're usually chaotic because of internal reasons, not because of the end customer demand. So actually we are creating the chaos that we are giving to our operations and then hoping that they will somehow stabilize and do the right thing. And yet people are not paying enough attention, I think, to understanding the chaos that they're creating. And instead of the usual answer, which is we will build another automated IT system to solve that problem, actually address the root causes of those problems. The result of this business model is that you have no transparency. It's all about political negotiation at the top. It's also about political negotiation all the way down. So there's no transparency. There's no hope of stability. And there's no problem solving as a result. Because if you don't have a stable base, how can you do any systematic problem solving and know that, in fact, begin to understand where the causality lies and where the root cause of those problems lie? So actually, our biggest problem in this new world is not just the asset drag from existing assets, which is significant, but it's the asset drag of the mindsets and behaviors of top management. So that's interesting, and that means that the typical reactions over this last 20 years, and it's now happening in the public sector, big outsourcing contract just announced by the British government, it's led to the easy options. We'll outsource, we'll offshore, and we'll automate. We'll automate broken processes, and we know what happens when you automate broken processes. You add a lot of cost, and you certainly don't improve the customer experience. And there's no focus on total cost. There's no focus on end-to-end understanding of the total costs of delivering value through all of the activities in the value stream. And the traditional Taylorist command and control business model, of course, naturally thinks about hiring lean skills by hiring experts. The do-it-for-me manager wants do-it-for-me consultants who will come and do lean to my people. and hoping that that will somehow last beyond the engagement of those consultants. And look, we've all been guilty of being part of that. But it doesn't work, and it certainly doesn't last. So if we are not actually building the capabilities into the value stream to run and improve that value stream, then how can we possibly imagine that things are going to be sustained? And yet we can't do that unless management fundamentally changes the way it relates to the workforce. Unless we have an additional mental model of how, how the horizontal flows need also to be managed in addition to the vertical flows and in addition to the building of capabilities. So this is actually a slide of us doing quite the opposite. Of not doing it for people, this seeing the whole activity, looking at the whole business on one sheet, was an activity we drove with the executives, each of them putting their own piece of the story on the board and saying, my goodness, is that how we work? And then gradually getting them to understand the sources of noise that are created within that system that have impacts right across the system. And then beginning to think about what actions could be taken to address those sources of noise that would create the stability that would then make lean improvement activities fruitful. So actually we have been adopting a very different approach. And Dave is the last person who would ever tolerate do-it-for-me consultants. So don't get misled by this slide. So I think if we're thinking about a framework for understanding lean transformations and beginning to seriously study lean transformations, we have lots of anecdotal evidence. But actually, to me, that's not enough, because most of the anecdotal evidence reinforces our own mental models that we believe happen. And most of those mental models are actually wrong. So actually, if we're going to really study how lean transformations are successful, we need a framework for doing that. And the framework has 5 key elements, and I just want to talk about those 5. The first of all is it actually starts with the product. And if you've been following Jim Morgan's e-letters on the Lean Post, he has been reinforcing this message from his experience at Ford. And it's an extremely important lesson that unless you have an activity that develops the right products, then everything else is actually a waste of time. We spend so much time improving our current operations with the current assets and the current product design with the costs already baked in that we don't spend enough time rethinking the product. Jim's going to talk about that, so I won't talk more about that at this point. But I went to Saskatchewan, of all places, in Canada, in searching for a Canadian example for my talk at AME just recently. And I came across a fascinating example that illustrates another facet of this point of trying to develop the right understanding of value and the right products or the right service. And this was a hospital system, 1 million people in Saskatchewan, it's not a big place, a hospital system that has been doing lean over the last 5 or 6 years, right across the hospital system. Very impressive results with Hoshin at the top with lots of good improvement activities. They could still be doing a lot better, but a lot of good improvement activities. They had the opportunity to design 3 new hospitals on a clean sheet. And they had a warehouse and they did a 3P exercise with 3 sets of patients and users. All of the people who manage the flows and are part of the flows in the hospital, plus patients. Do a 3P exercise, really structured exercise for designing, for analyzing all of the flows through the hospital and deciding where are best, what the best configuration is. The architects and the contractors were allowed to stand at the side of the room, but were not allowed to say anything. Very interesting. And they had 3 of these sessions and came up with a very, very similar end result. And this is the mock-up of 1 floor, 2 floors of a very simple 300-bed hospital. And they had also mocked up in live with cardboard and everything, mocked up 3 standard rooms and configured the right configuration and replenishment actions and so on and so forth. Very interesting exercise in mobilizing the intellect, the knowledge of the people who actually run the processes and experience how broken they are with the experience of patients who experience being treated in such a system. And they're now building that hospital just down the road, and it's stunningly small compared to what you'd imagine for a hospital of that size. So it's a really interesting exercise to be able to clean sheet and get a bunch of real users together to understand their processes and design the configuration, rather than giving the architect a brief and getting him to imagine what might happen. And the interesting thing there is that they have built in the capability for that building to learn. As their experience develops, they can move most of the walls in that building and reconfigure it. So I just thought that was a really, really interesting exercise. And Dan Florizone, who was the hospital chief exec, then became the head of what we would call permanent secretary for healthcare across Saskatchewan, has driven this. Terrific personality. And he's also now been moved to education, and together with colleagues in social services, in the police and justice, in healthcare, they're doing this right across government in Saskatchewan. He's the Minister for Lean Across Government, Deputy Minister for Lean Across Government. Now that's an interesting story. So an inspiring, interesting, different take on the importance of systematically building user feedback into the design of the value, into embodying that in assets that are going to deliver services. And the third strand of defining value is learning from the lean startup movement, where literally you are developing something completely new into a completely unknown market, where you don't know how customers are going to react to this. They've never seen it before. So in the lean startup movement, they are emphasizing building minimum viable products very quickly and then testing those on the marketplace and going through systematic test cycles. So building a dialogue with customers that gradually evolves and steers the development of the design of the solution. So there are many different ways in which we can systematically define value, as we would say it in the past. I would say now that we can define the right product and the right service and the right experience in different kinds of situations. And if we don't start there, then all the improvement activity on the current process and so on will only have a limited effect. This can have very dramatic effects, both in people's mindsets and in the way they behave. And I was there with the Deputy Minister for the Prime Minister, the Premier's office, and he was absolutely blown away by this experience, by viewing this 3P exercise. So kind of interesting. Second, so getting the product right. Of course, at the same time, we need to rethink the process. And this is the GKN example from several years ago. If we don't think end-to-end, then we're just going to be piece optimizing our design activity. We have to think end-to-end. And that's hard to do, and yet companies are just beginning to think of doing that. Terribly important. What is the total end-to-end activity across several organizations that we need to mobilize in order to deliver that value? And the second insight here, I think, from healthcare is that in healthcare, the patient is actually not just receiving the product, they're experiencing the process of receiving the product. And somehow we also need to learn from that to build the customer experience into the end-to-end process. What would the customer really, if the customer really saw your process, would they really want to pay for most of the things you do currently? And the answer is absolutely not. And the third aspect from the construction industry, long been the bane of the construction industry of integrating the design activities with the fabrication and assembly part, with the design and build. And it's exactly the same in IT. Unless we have a correctly specified process that we want to automate with expert users who've really leaned that process, how can you possibly think of designing the right IC solution to automate that? So instead of automating broken processes, we have to spend a lot more time defining not just the product, but also the process that we're trying to improve. So integration of design, build in IT and in construction, very important piece of that story. So product, process. And the third is the work, understanding the work. This is a plan for every patient board in a hospital, where you can see plan versus actual for each patient. You can see the plan for the stay of the patient, and you can see notes as the patient goes through that journey. So knowledge of the work, the ability to stabilize the work, and I think that also has to do with stabilizing the information flow that drives the work. Standardization, where you can, builds the foundation for improvement. And it builds the foundation for daily practice of making improvements. The daily practice of PDCA, the daily practice of Kaizen. It's the true meaning of Kaizen. Is practice. Dave's talked about lean is a practice that is learnt by doing. And visibility, we know about this. We have to make the work visible. We have to make it possible for the team to respond quickly to deviations, to then do problem solving on more root cause problems, and much more important, to actually learn from that problem solving. It's the learning from that problem solving of things that didn't quite work out as we expected that builds the richness and deepness of people's lean practice. And we need to learn to collaborate horizontally along the value stream and to manage that with value stream managers and so on, to align the activities with demand, with real demand, not with perceived demand or chaotic information. And the end product of this process of improving the capabilities is to build the capabilities to solve tomorrow's problems. Not just solve this problem, but take the learning out of solving this problem to solve tomorrow's problems. So product, process, the work, and management. This is this healthcare wall in Saskatchewan. So I really think that management, the dimensions of management are becoming very clear. Leadership is about being able to see the whole. And that's why Jim and I have emphasized taking Gemba walks for a long time. When we're looking at a Gemba walk, we're looking at the process, but actually we're looking at the manager next to us and seeing how he relates to the work and what questions he asks. That tells us everything about that we need to know about the current way this process is seen and managed. So seeing the whole and being able to diagnose the points in the system that cause the major blockages to the rest of the system or that trigger instability in the rest of the system, that skill, that's a real skill that management need to learn. Again, through practice, by walking, by analyzing, by asking questions, seeing through the fog. Certainly it's about setting direction and focusing on the vital few. And this is hard. Getting the list of 60 projects down to 3 or 5 is a task that most executive teams really, really struggle with. Because it means changing to focus on the facts rather than on the politics. So it involves a fundamental change of mindset and way management teams work collaboratively. Now, will that happen? Hoshin provides a framework for that dialogue to approximate to that process. Hoshin is not the tool, it's the dialogue around the tool. And I think it's also, if you can see what's wrong with the flow, if you can then focus on the vital few, both for the external, to satisfy the external world, but also to unblock the key obstacles in the flow, then you can deploy the right experiments. But deploying the right experiments is another skill because actually the real problems are still hidden. And it's only when you deploy real experiments, as certainly as we found in healthcare, that you actually uncover another layer of problems. Absence of operational management, put in operational management, absence of management of the operations. Put that in a financial accounting system that runs completely counter to the needs of the flow, and so on and so forth. So the skill of deploying the right projects isn't just to unblock the obstacles, it's also to reveal the hidden underlying contradictions that need to be resolved and surfaced. And that's a management skill. And we've talked a lot about learning to coach and mentor subordinates. So there you have 4 elements. The 5th final element is, if you like, the mindset, the mental models, the vision, the science, if you like, of science that lies behind this, the common thought processes and practice that lies behind this. And I've talked about this in previous summits, and I hope some of you have gone away and read the phenomenally good book called Ignorance, which is all about what science is really all about, and it's about framing the questions about the things we don't know yet. Not just about testing current hypotheses and writing those up in journals. It's about asking the right questions. And that's a real skill, having a rigorous method for defining the right questions. If you look at the history of medicine, the breakthroughs have all come by people framing the question in a novel way and looking in unexpected places to find the answer. Not by a very rational process of discovery incrementally, as we imagine science takes place. Science is really about what we don't know and asking the right questions. And the scientific method, the scientific thought process, is learnt through daily practice. Can't emphasize that more. That is how we learn to think, to recalibrate our brain to think in a systematic way. It's all about clear thinking, clear, rational thinking, fact-based thinking. And we learn that by doing it daily. And we also learn to take responsibility for developing capability, for solving problems and developing our own capabilities and the capabilities of others. That's also what science is about. And in Lean, we're not looking for underlying laws. We're looking to use the process, the scientific thought process, to address situational problems that are different with complex causalities. We are looking to solve today's problem in today's situation and to develop stronger hypotheses for addressing a similar but slightly different problem tomorrow. We're not looking for laws, we're looking for, it's actually the scientific thought process itself that we're using. And if you're going to integrate activities along the value stream and get everybody totally integrated and take away all the buffers, so you have a pure flow of value creation, we're all interdependent. And so there's no way we can separate thinking from doing. And this is where Lean parts company with Taylorism. Taylorism justified the role of experts and consultants. I mentioned that brilliant book, The Myth of Management, which you also should read, which exposes the fact that most of that rhetoric was not based on science at all. It was based upon the need on a narrative that people wanted justification for, which is the role of experts and consultants. In a Lean system, the thinking and the doing has to be combined. And we cannot have experts, it's not that we don't have experts, but we cannot have experts just delegate the process of thinking and to experts away from the process. We miss most of the experience that is involved in daily practice. So really fundamental that we re-understand the scientific approach and the significance of the scientific approach to Lean. Now, over the last couple of years, small team led by John Shook, including Dave and I at some point, have been trying to develop a model for systematically analyzing transformations, and that has these 5 elements in. It's the product, it's the situational approach, it's the defining the problem, it's the process, it's improving the process. All value is the result of a process. And good outcomes come from a good process. And a good process depends on understanding of the work and building capabilities to improve it. And that, in turn, has to be enabled and directed by a different style of management, of leadership. And the foundation is this common thought process. And it's about Gemba, it's about PDCA, it's about Kaizen, and so on and so forth. It's all about the scientific approach. So this is the framework that we're now working on. And we're developing a framework for not only analyzing this using FMEA, for instance. What are the failure modes in this model? But also, what are the right questions and what are the right ways we might evaluate lean transformations? This will give us a more scientific approach that will give us better insights. Not the perfect answer, will give us better insights into what makes a good lean transformation. And that's the task that we set the Lean Global movement, the Lean Global Network, 2 years ago. And we're gradually progressing, and we have now some very good building blocks to fill out this model and operationalize this model. But I think it gives us a framework for answering the question of what makes a lean transformation work. There will always be personality, circumstance, situational factors, but there's a core also of understanding the sequence and the interaction and the dynamics of a lean transformation that can give a lot more people the courage to go down this route than simply relying on individual stories. So that's what we've been doing, and that's really the task that the Lean Global Network is uniquely placed to solve, because all of our institutes are doing transformation projects of one kind or another. This provides a much more structured framework for addressing those as experiments and then learning the lessons from them and sharing those lessons. So that's the task the Lean Global Network is going to address over the next 18 months to 2 years. I think that's a noble objective, and I wish them well.